Can you see me now? Hi everyone! Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your presentation, Elena. It was really wonderful. I'm an undergrad at UC Berkeley. I'm studying integrative biology, interdisciplinary studies, and gender and women's studies. This paper, I hope it's not too technical, and I hope it's accessible. So please feel free to ask any clarifying questions in the Q&A if need be. Just so you understand where I'm coming from with this paper, it's situated within a larger project to bring animals into feminist science studies. So feminist science studies take a feminist lens to the history and philosophy of science. So that's where this is situated, and it's a work in progress. So I'd appreciate any critiques or comments on where you think I should go from here. All right, so I'm going to start. Feminist objectivity makes room for surprises and ironies at the heart of all knowledge production. We are not alone in the world. We just live here and try to strike up non-innocent conversations, dominate away situated knowledges. Toxic bodies are decidedly post-human. At this point in time, all bodies, both human and non-human, contend with some level of corporeal and environmental toxicity. Tracing one particular toxin, atrazine, this paper will inquire into corporeal politics, queerness, laboratory practices, binary schemas, and the questions of non-human agency. Examining Professor Tyrone B. Hayes' atrazine studies, this paper will place Judith Butler's theories on the materialization of sex in conversation with feminist material conceptions of lively matter and non-human agency. Building on Butler's examination of the discursive and institutional conditions by which matter comes into being, I will argue for an approach to the study of scientific practice that takes seriously both the material and the discursive. Atrazine is the most commonly used herbicide in the United States, possibly in the world. Produced by Syngenta, the largest chemical company in the world, and consumed by the United States, the country with the largest economy in the world, atrazine is ubiquitous. Yet the use of atrazine is not without controversy. Found in 75% of surface water and 40% of groundwater, atrazine is the largest cause of water contamination in the U.S. Atrazine has caused the evolution of herbicide-resistant weeds in over 60 plant species, more than any other herbicide in history. Recent scientific studies have correlated atrazine with wildlife population declines, also linked to cancer, birth defects, reproductive abnormalities, neurotoxicity, kidney and liver damage, immune disease, toxic irritation, and other human health effects. Atrazine affects the environment and human corporeality in complex and potentially dangerous ways. Because of these environmental and human health threats, Europe, including Switzerland, which is the home country of Syngenta, banned the use of atrazine. While the EPA classifies atrazine as a Class 3 toxin, atrazine use has not been restricted in any significant way in the United States. Dr. Tyrone B. Hayes, environmental activist and integrative biology professor at UC Berkeley, has emerged as one of the primary scientific authorities on atrazine. His laboratory studies the reproductive consequences of atrazine exposure in adult amphibians. In Hayes' famous 2010 study, he raised 40 male African clawed frogs in 2.5 parts per billion atrazine solution for 3 years, which is, by the way, less than the limit that the EPA puts on our drinking water. This study found that 30 of the frogs were demasculinized or chemically castrated, meaning that the frogs were incapable of reproducing or they experienced other gender abnormalities such as depressed testosterone, decreased breeding gland size, demasculinized laryngeal development, suppressed mating behavior, or reduced spermatogenesis or fertility. 4 of the atrazine-exposed males, which was 10% of the population, were completely feminized, meaning that they developed into, and I'm quoting Hayes here, functional females that copulated with unexposed males and produced viable eggs. Or, as the press describes this phenomena in a particular male frog, he became, quote, the mother of his children. Other studies done by Hayes confirm a correlation between atrazine exposure and gonadal abnormalities. He's observed hermaphroditism in atrazine-exposed wild frogs, retarded gonadal development in other amphibian species, multiple testes or gonads. Hayes' research also demonstrates a link between atrazine exposure and homosexual behavior in amphibians. According to an interview with Public Radio International, atrazine-exposed frogs are 10 times more prone to homosexual behavior. Hayes tells the interviewer that the tank with atrazine solution has, and I'm quoting Hayes here, lots of gay males, homosexual pairs. And to explain these reproductive abnormalities, Hayes proposes that atrazine functions as an endocrine disruptor that interferes with the proper synthesis and functioning of testosterone by converting testosterone to estranol, which is an estrogen derivative, thus increasing the levels of female hormones in the male body. I want to begin analyzing the scientific and cultural dimensions of Hayes' atrazine studies by arguing that his research is dependent on and rendered salient by the contemporary socio-historical and discursive moment. In Bodies That Matter, Butler argues that material differences are always marked and formed by discursive practice, meaning that materialization always occurs within and is influenced by particular discursive demarcations. In particular, Butler thinks through the relationship between the material and the discursive in relation to sexual difference. According to Butler, sex, and I'm quoting her here, is not a simple fact or static condition of the body, but is a process whereby regulatory norms materialize sex and achieve this materialization through the forcible reiteration of norms. Sex is not simply a matter of material difference, but is itself part of a regulatory practice that produces the bodies it governs, through forcibly compelling the materialization of bodies. The functioning of the regulatory norms of sex are both productive and performative in the sense that the normalizing discourse produces and demarcates the very effect it names. Sexual difference materializes through the reiterative and citational qualities of discourse. If we rethink materiality as the effect of power and as power's most productive effect, we can think of sex as not simply a static description of the body, but instead one of the norms that delimits the conditions of the material and disqualifies a body for, I'm quoting Butler here, a life within the domain of cultural intelligibility. The point that I want to make in relation to Hayes' atrazine studies is that the materialization of sex occurs within particular discursive and institutional conditions that render specific material differences salient. The materialization of the sex of Hayes frogs is governed by the reiterative power that produces the very phenomena of sexual difference. In other words, the criteria used to define the differential materiality of male and female frog bodies is not neutral or objective, but instead regulatory, citational, and discursively enabled. I want to move away from thinking of sex as something that can be objectively observed by science, to argue that the materiality of reproductive abnormalities in Hayes frogs is, quote, indissociable from the regulatory norms that govern their materialization, end quote, in the sense that the matter of their bodies only makes sense within the contemporary regulatory power. Perhaps the very observation of sex is part of the regulatory matrix that produces sex that is being observed. Here, I'm suggesting that the practices of science are in part of the discursive matrix that enable and constrain the materialization of sexual difference, or, more broadly, that the observer and the practices of observation are formative of the very phenomena being observed. Well, one way to look at the operation of particular regulatory schemas of sexual difference in Hayes frogs is to examine the unmaking and the remaking of the gender binary in specific scientific and cultural discourse. I want to argue that the concept of sex itself is troubled terrain, in the sense that the criteria for distinguishing between the two sexes involves multiple contested histories and power dynamics. Specifically, the cultural and scientific discourse surrounding Hayes frogs illuminates the ambiguous and often contradictory criteria, chromosomes, mating behavior, gonads, hormonal profile, and body size, that are used to determine sex in the contemporary moment. For instance, Scientific American imagines atrazine as, quote,